topic that I would be talking about is actually on South Asia. So after hearing about a lot of issues about global scenarios about from the global north, from the global south, and also about multilateralism and a whole lot of issues, I think it's also important to look at specific regions and what their specific requirements are at this time of crisis. And I will be talking about South Asia with some more emphasis on India. It is a huge crisis in this region, although the numbers in terms of infected cases and deaths may be low in many of these countries, but we are looking at the numbers going up and spiraling, maybe out of control, in especially countries like India. Now, the issues that are at hand, of course, are multiple. I don't think it is just restricted to COVID-19 pandemic or environmental issues. It is also linked to socioeconomic issues. It is also linked to health issues. So there are a whole lot of factors that are at stake here. And I think in that respect, majority of the South Asian countries are vulnerable to the cascading impacts of this COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the crisis that is linked to the lockdown measures and other kinds of measures that have been put in place by governments of the region. Maybe I would like to start with the issue of disasters itself. And I think this is probably the largest, this is probably the most vulnerable part of the world in terms of cyclones, flooding, drought. So it's not just slow onset disasters, there's rapid onset disasters and a whole lot of other disasters that we are facing. As I said, the extreme heat conditions would be probably one of the biggest challenges that the disaster management authorities and governments are going to face over here, because the Indian Meteorological Department, for instance, has already declared that this summer is going to be warmer than usual. And that means that, everybody has to deal with not just the COVID-19 pandemic, but also the extreme heat conditions. And especially at a time when everybody's following lockdown measures and not everybody has access to air conditioning, for instance, everybody's cramped up in small spaces where extreme heat is something that everybody is vulnerable to. And concerns regarding extreme heat is just one aspect. Now, we are also now coming close to the onset of the southwest monsoon. Now, as you know, the flooding disasters that we have seen in the past few years have led to immense amount of losses, immense amount of deaths. Now, if you look at examples like Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, which has been susceptible to cyclones, to flooding, drought, deforestation, landslides. And this is probably the world's largest refugee camp where the Rohingyas are housed. And what does this indicate? Now, amidst pandemic and amidst this kind of disaster, the kind of pressure that is going to be put on government agencies and disaster management authorities will be immense. And that is why you can already see India's National Disaster Management Authority is already talking about, okay, we are going to look at multiple hazards at the same time now. So you need integrated risk assessment, you need integrated risk management that needs to be looked at, especially at a time when the pandemic is kind of unleashing havoc all across this region. The second point that I wanted to raise was about food insecurity. And I think this is probably another major issue that we will see coming up, not just in India, but also in other countries like Bangladesh, Pakistan, also Afghanistan, which, by the way, is still undergoing this spiraling effects of conflict, hasn't really come out of the conflict trap. And what does this mean? Like COVID-19 is just one aspect. You have drought, you have food insecurity, which comes from that. Now, those kind of issues are something that again leads to this kind of conflict trap and that kind of cycle, which countries may not be able to come out of that easily. So yes, in terms of food insecurity, there is a possibility of food riots, for instance, if the agricultural activities are hampered to such an extent that there is not enough food supplies. That is just one part, but livelihood insecurity associated with the agrarian crisis that we are in the middle of. So the agrarian crisis is not just related to COVID-19. South Asia has been facing this crisis for a long period of time. And because of various reasons, including recurring drought and recurring floodings, And because of which, we also have had a lot of migration, for instance, from rural to urban areas. And now you see the reverse migration happening from urban areas to rural areas because people are out of jobs. Unemployment has become huge. Because of the lockdown measures, daily wages have gone out of jobs, and construction workers, for instance, also have gone out of jobs. And that is why there is this huge insecurity that is looming large in this region. Because a large section of the population is still employed by the informal economy. And so we are talking about informal sectors which are in much grave danger as compared to the other sectors. So the disruptions that are caused by this kind of changes in the supply chains and the manufacturing sector, the MSMEs, the micro, mini, small enterprises, which also, by the way, dominate sectors like the renewable energy sector, they all have come to a halt right now. So much more action needs to be done in order to put some stimulus into these sectors. So that's the second point about food insecurity, which is also linked to, like I said, livelihood insecurity. So there is a question of equity and justice here, which is also, like I said, linked to human security and environmental change. And I feel, especially for countries of the global south, the so-called global south, and countries of South Asia, this is a huge issue. That's one major area. The other point is about, of course, how we are going to come out of this crisis and how we are going to deal with this emergency. And I think this is probably the question that everybody is asking, like, will the recovery, the so-called recovery, I mean, when and if that happens, because we are still facing that dilemma of trying to choose between lives and economy and trying to have different kinds of approaches to deal with the pandemic. That's just one part. But how do you deal with the pandemic in terms of the recovery? Now, many people say that, yes, I mean, that's one of the things that people are rejoicing over, that, oh, the Himalayas are now visible almost 200 to 300 kilometers away, which hasn't happened in the past 30 years or so. The air has become cleaner, the water has become clearer. So the Ganga and the Yamuna, these rivers, which are usually considered highly polluted, have suddenly become clearer because of the lockdown measures. But is this something that is sustainable in the long run? I'm not really sure about that. Now, that's the problem. So when we had this relief package that was announced a couple of days ago by the Indian government, it's huge, by the way. It's 10% of India's GDP, the whole relief package. Now, that is huge in comparison to many other countries. How much of it is going to be channeled towards renewable energy or other kinds of climate-friendly measures or climate adaptation or building resilience is something huge question mark over there. We don't know how things are going to pan out. And although, yeah, of course, another good news, by the way, is that, yeah, in the past 1 year, India's emissions have dropped by 1%. So, yeah, I mean, probably this is a good signal, but that is because we've had an economic slowdown. Yes, there is renewable energy expansion that has happened as well. But at the same time, it is during this lockdown period that most of the emissions came down. So is this what we are looking at, or I mean, at what cost is something we will keep asking ourselves? Do we need this kind of a change in the systems, or do we actually bring in more of structural reforms that Vincente also talked about? I think that is what is very central to the question of our recovery from this situation. And if you look at countries like Maldives, I think it's a very crucial period for countries like Maldives, because tourism, which is the biggest sector for revenue generation for countries like Maldives and Bhutan also, if tourism sector, of course, in terms of numbers, Maldives is not as much affected. Yeah, not that many people have been tested positive, but the tourism sector has completely come to a halt. And what does that mean? There is not enough revenue generation, and of course, tourism sector is also the biggest employer in this country. Now, where will the money come from, like resources come from for climate adaptation or other kinds of resilience building activities that these countries have planned in the past few years? So there is this huge amount of uncertainty, not just at the national level, but also the global at the global level, the world economy, and how these things would pan out for countries in South Asia. So, I mean, one of the things that I was reading in Pakistan, for instance, they are now re-employing or employing those unemployed laborers who lost their jobs because of the lockdown measures. Now they are kind of growing trees. I mean, so they are the jungle warriors or something. So I mean, this could be just a stopgap measure. This is just a stopgap measure, but in terms of the relief packages, which all the governments have announced, by the way, but we have to see how things will be. Yes, coal consumption has gone down, oil consumption has gone down, electricity consumption has gone down in the region in the past 1 month or so. But this is a trend that may not continue. I already see a coal mine, for instance, for being given clearance by the Environment Ministry in India, which may be completely flouting environmental regulations. We don't know, but a lot of things are being cleared during this time. Big projects, which may not be really in consonance with the environmental objectives that we have in place. So yes, the problems are galore, and the uncertainties associated with problems is even bigger. So I think we have to wait and see as to how and where our focus is going to be. The entire region's focus is going to be in the future when it comes to the green growth or low carbon growth and everything that we are talking about. Yeah. Thank you so much.